And we are live.
We got to wait for that
Theoretically,
ticker. We got to wait for that ticker to show me people. I want to see people. You call it a ticker? I don't know. You call it a ticker? Feels like a ticker to me.
counter? I don't know.
Counter.
Ticker's better.
We're,
Shows me one.
our first viewer is on Twitter. The glorious return, as the prophecy foretold.
Yes, that's true. We're back on Twitter. We've been off for a few months, but we got it all straightened out. So we are tonight streaming on YouTube. We're streaming on Facebook. We're streaming on Twitter. And we're just at the mercy of Instagram whenever they want to, whenever the Instagram gods want to just gift us and bestow us with the ability to live stream. Until then, it's YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter.
Marty, did you notice that somebody named me followed you on Twitter the other day?
Maybe.
Wow.
Are you
Did
saying
you-
Patrick
did you
Mahomes
get
followed Marty
did
on
you get
Twitter?
on-
Or what are you
Did
saying?
you get on Twitter?
I do low-key have a Twitter, a Twitter.
Wow. Well, it's not low key anymore. A whole 16 people have heard you say it.
Now they know. At Redent.
The problem
gonna
is if you
introduce-
joined after it became X, you can't call it Twitter. You don't have the seniority to do that.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Okay. I have an X. Is that what I'm supposed to say? It just sounds
I
like
know,
somebody
it sounds,
broke up with
it's
me.
so dumb, right? It's so dumb. All right. Well, we
All right,
have
everybody.
comments coming in from Facebook and YouTube.
good.
I do need, if somebody's watching on Twitter, please leave me a comment to make sure I'm getting your comments. I still cannot send comments to Twitter, even though we're paying them, whatever dollars a year now, but I can at
Yeah.
least get the comments in. So put your questions in the comments. I will be monitoring that. You do not need to repeat your questions throughout the hours. But we're
All right,
here.
we've got introductions we got to make. Got a new face here tonight, but we'll start with our general stuff before we get to that. We got to start with telling people when our next live stream is going to be. Our next Q&A is one of those GMT editions. So we do those on our Sunday when we can go a little earlier. So 4 p.m. Eastern time, Sunday, October 20th. We do that for our folks over in Europe and other time zones that might just find it hard to make an 8 p.m. Eastern time. So whenever we do Sunday, we often like to go early. We don't always do it, but we often like to. So Sunday, October 20th, everybody. 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. And when I looked, it was 9 p.m. GMT. Is that because of daylight saving time? I don't know. Educate me, Brent Billings.
Yeah, they shift time at a different time of year than we do. So
All right. Well, whatever it
Yeah.
is, it's more accessible for all those night owls. And we've got our typical lineup. I'm going to introduce Reed here in a moment. I have been saving questions for Reed since April of 2023. So we've got ourselves a little list. I don't know, 8, 9, 10 questions. We got a handful on the front half. We got a handful on the back half, and we'll take live questions in the middle. Reed probably won't go as long as I do. Reed
Definitely won't.
can't hack it quite like I can. Doesn't,
Definitely can't.
So there we go. Let me introduce Reed. Reed is this is the last co-host for all of you that have not made it to session 6. This is the last co-host that we need to introduce to you. For those of you that are signed up for the Baymon Messenger, our newsletter, you've seen the news this last month that we're going to be rebooting session 1 with all of the hosts, so you'll meet them a lot earlier in your journey. But for those of you that haven't met, you've now met Elle. Was it February? You met Josh this summer. And now you've met Reed, and this will round out the whole team. And I've introduced each one of these co-hosts on these live streams, kind of told you who they were, what I appreciate about them. Reed is, I'll try to be serious here for a moment. Reed is one of my best friends. I love our relationship, and that probably doesn't I assume so much that doesn't translate into the podcast medium, the hard time we give each other back and forth, but have enjoyed our friendship for years. But I also enjoy the way that he thinks, the way that he communicates. I love the way he will write. He's one of the, well, I think, I'm trying to think if I know of anybody else. He's the only manuscript preacher that I love to listen to. Like, he's so good at it. And part of that is a testimony to the way that he communicates, the way that he writes. He's a little bit more of a philosopher. So I think I described Josh as a mystic, a contemplative. L is L, like scholar, Hebrew extraordinaire, sassy pants. And then you've got Reed, who is the philosopher of the bunch. And there you go. That's his. I think that's. I'll let him introduce himself anymore if he wants to. He's a campus minister in Missouri, Truman State University. Is one of the leaders. Is the leader of CCF there. Campus Christian Fellowship. I visit there probably once a semester. Every year, have a great relationship there, and at that point, my introduction is going to just devolve. He's a Chiefs fan. He's everything. Never mind.
Not a bandwagoner. Not a bandwagoner. I grew up in Kansas City, so been watching since Joe Montana days. Thank you for the wonderful introduction.
Well,
I think go ahead.
No, I'm going to bail here and let you keep doing your preamble, but I did have one live question that I was asked. I didn't. A listener asked me to ask you this. I didn't. I did it.
I can't wait to hear this.
This is our first live question that I want to submit to you for the Q&A. It's not coming from me. I can show you the screenshot so you can know it's not me.
Of course I trust you. Of course I trust you.
But they wanted to know, can the Chiefs win a game on their own without a penalty? Notice the way this question is phrased. I love this question. It's not phrased like that the penalty was the wrong call. It's not saying that it's not making any other case other than a really good question. Can the Chiefs win without it? That's all we want to know.
Well, maybe if the Chiefs' opponents felt like they could win without cheating, we would have an opportunity to find out. But everybody feels like they have to cheat to beat us. And so how can I answer that question?
I'm hearing no. I'm out, everybody. See you later.
Oh, bye, Marty.
Well, yeah, give me a little bit more personal stuff. I think Doreen has commented that the comments are empty right now, which is pretty much true. There's a lot of football comments coming in from YouTube. I'm guessing because their logo is red that all the Chiefs people are on YouTube. I don't know. But yeah, people need to know a little bit more about you before they start submitting their questions, I guess. So tell me a little
besides
more,
just
Reed.
Chiefs football stuff.
Yeah.
It is true that I work as a campus minister with college students. That's what I've done for 16 years now. It's actually how Marty and I met because Impact Campus Ministries is a part of the same national association that CCF is a part of. And we met at a conference. And that was back in like 2015. We had similar interests. We had been reading similar things. It sounded like I was in a workshop. And so I said, hey, you're going to have dinner with me. And then we had like a 3-hour conversation, and then fast forward a few years, and here we are, great friends and colleagues and all of that. Philosopher is that's a fine word. To be honest, like a lot of philosophy, like real philosophy is just kind of over my head. I like to talk about human nature. I like to talk about spiritual practices. I'm kind of a pastor at heart, so like pastoral concerns are things that I like to speak to. I have a degree in English, actually, and I really get into just narrative elements of the text. That's probably why the first time that I did sort of my own little series on Bema, it was on the parables, because they're little stories and just perfect for kind of the way that I think. So those are more my things. I'm not really like the midrash expert. Like I've read some midrash and I dabble, I guess, but I'm no big expert on that. Or just like other just really specifically Jewish elements of like the text or theology that kind of come up, like a lot of those questions that people come to Bema for. I am not really the guy that's I am probably the least knowledgeable about all of those things of all the co-hosts. But yeah, like the other things, I mean, my episodes that I've done, the first ones were on deconstruction, just talking about that as a concept, talking about that as like sort of a practice, and then parables and psalms, spiritual practice, that kind of stuff. I also, I'm going to do this whether Marty would allow me to or not. I'm going to start by reading something about questions. This is a Q&A, a question and answer. If anybody has listened to anything that I've ever said about anything for more than 10 seconds, you've heard me quote Frederick Buechner, rest in peace. He is my all-time greatest influence. He is my rabbi, so to speak. Well, other than Jesus, obviously. But I love Buechner, so I want to, if I may.
You tricked me, Reed. I saw this and I just read right over it. I was like, oh, some poem by some rando. And if I had thought about it, or whatever, I didn't know what it was. It just says, read questions by Freddie B.
Yeah, Freddie B. That's we're close friends, so that's what I refer to him as Freddie B. or just Freddie. I love Buechner, and I quote him endlessly in sermons and on podcast episodes. And I also said in the first episode I was on that I enjoy reading out loud to people. We were actually we were in Turkey this summer. I was with Marty, and you were there. We were roommates, Brent. And some of the people that I met, the first thing that they said to me was, "Can you read to us out loud sometime on this trip?" Which is just a strange question to be asked the very first time you meet somebody. But I also was there for it because I do love that. So this is a definition. Bear with me for one page. This is a definition for the word questions written by Frederick Buechner in a book called Wishful Thinking. He says this: on her deathbed, Gertrude Stein is said to have asked, "What is the answer?" Then, after a long silence, "What is the question?" Don't start looking in the Bible for the answers it gives. Start by listening for the questions it asks. We are much involved, all of us, with questions about things that matter a good deal today but will be forgotten by this time tomorrow. The immediate wheres and whens and hows that face us daily at home and at work. But at the same time, we tend to lose track of the questions about things that matter always, life and death questions about meaning, purpose, and value. To lose track of such deep questions as these is to risk losing track of who we really are in our own depths and where we are really going. There is perhaps no stronger reason for reading the Bible than that somewhere among all those India paper pages there awaits each reader, whoever he is, the one question which, though for years he may have been pretending not to hear it, is the central question of his own life. Here are a few of them. What is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Am I my brother's keeper? If God is for us, who can be against us? What is truth? How can a man be born when he is old? What does a man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? Where shall I go from thy spirit? Who is my neighbor? What shall I do to inherit eternal life? When you hear the question that is your question, then you have already begun to hear much. Whether you can accept the Bible's answer or not, you have reached the point where at least you can begin to hear it too. Freddie B. So I like to get us off on that foot, to think about the kinds of questions that we want to ask and maybe the questions that are underneath those questions. But I'm not going to go on a long monologue about that. Shall we get to our first question here, Brent?
I think we shall. People seem to be warming up to you. They're submitting questions in the chat. One of them
good.
has to do with Midrash. So he said he was not done typing it. And then you said that, and he's like, well, I might as well send it.
Might as well ask it anyway. Sorry, I might disappoint you, or I might just not answer. But we can save that for also another time when a different teacher is on.
We don't save any of the live questions.
Oh, never mind. We're going to
That's not
throw
how
it in
this
the
works.
trash can.
Yeah, exactly.
Here we go. This is a question from Dave, and he said, I have two specific questions. Do you think leaders should make Jesus their leadership role model? That's one. And two, do you have any books or resources that you would recommend as part of my ongoing research to talk about how to do leadership? This is a good question, and I think it's a question that makes some sense because Jesus, I mean, like church CEO, big boss, head of the church, and there is a certain logic, I think, that would make sense of Jesus being our role model for leadership. But I don't think it's maybe as sensible as it might seem at first blush. And I guess maybe a question to start with is kind of what are we imagining a leader is, or a leader of what? And I'm not sure the particular context that this listener was asking about leadership. What I know is leadership in a ministry organization or a church type organization. And to be sure, the way that you lead a ministry like that is probably different than the way that you lead a big business or a small business or any other kind of organization. So I will speak just to the idea of, I guess broadly, but again, keeping in mind that my experience is with ministry. And if we are imagining that a leader is somebody who gets things done or who makes things happen, that a leader is somebody who is tasked with leading the charge on growth and productivity, or if a leader is the person who's supposed to clearly communicate the vision, vision casting is a term that gets used a lot in churches, and if they're meant to inspire people, then maybe not. Maybe Jesus isn't our best role model for that. I mean, think about when he begins teaching in parables, which we talked about in our parables series. Parables were confusing. And he even said, they said, why do you speak to the people in parables? And he said, so that they might not understand. There is a certain element of his teaching that is actually meant to kind of confound, not just make it clear. So if we think that a leader is somebody who is, their job is to make everything totally clear, I'm not so sure. Or like Jesus provoked people. And maybe I don't know whether a leader should do that or not. Or I think the first passage, actually, the big one that came to my mind when I first saw this question is from John chapter 6. And Jesus has been talking about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And he just says it just like that and doesn't do a lot to soften the blow. And a lot of people who were listening, some of whom were disciples, were really dismayed and they were confused about, and they say, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept this? And it said from that time, many disciples turned their back and no longer followed him. And then and then he looks at the ones that are remaining and he says, essentially he prods them and he's like, don't you want to go too? He prods them to leave. And there are a lot of expectations for leaders in our culture that I know that is like, your job is to make things more. Your job is to make things bigger. Your job is to make things grow. And if there was a church leader who said something controversial and everybody left, and then he looked at the ones who were remaining and said, aren't you going to leave too? I would guess that his board of elders or whoever was governing might have some questions for him. And then, of course, Jesus told his followers, look, you want to follow me, you're going to die. Like, we're going to our deaths here. So it's worth keeping in mind as we think about Jesus being a role model for leadership. Like, Jesus is not trying to grow an organization. He is not trying to lead a group of people into, productivity or whatever. What he was trying to do was show this is what faithfulness looks like. This is what Torah is really about. This is what faithfulness to God really looks like. Like he was trying to suffer and die for the world in love, and then to teach and model for his followers how to do the same thing. So if that is what we hope that a leader will do, is teach their followers how to suffer and die for the world in love, then yes, Jesus is a great leader. If what we're looking for is clarity and vision casting and growth models, then Jesus is not the guy that we want to look for as our role model. The other part of the question from Dave was about recommended resources. I'll go through those quickly. Eugene Peterson wrote an excellent memoir called The Pastor. That's just about his life, 50 years in the pastorate at a Presbyterian church. And he has this great shorthand definition for any pastors who are listening, who are concerned about leading their churches. Eugene said that a pastor is not somebody who makes things happen or gets things done. A pastor is somebody who is placed within a community of people to pay attention and to call attention to what God is doing between people and God's self. That's the pastor's job. Pay attention and call attention. He also wrote a great book called Run with the Horses about the life of Jeremiah, which has insights about being a person who is trying to be faithful to God. And then there's another good book by a guy named M. Craig Barnes. He was dean at Princeton for some time at their seminary, and he wrote a book called Pastor as Minor Poet, which is good for pastors. I'm currently reading a book called Strong and Weak by Andy Crouch, which I'm liking a lot, and it's about authority and vulnerability in leadership. So check that one out, Dave. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say there's an essay by Annie Dillard called Expedition to the Pole, caveat lector, reader beware. It's kind of weird, but it is, in my mind, essential reading for anybody who is leading a church because, well, I'm not going to say anything else about it. Just take an expedition, read Expedition to the Pole, see how you feel about it. Let's see. There's a question here from Deb, a live question. I've wondered for a long time about a quote that I thought was Buechner, but maybe not. It's something about the three great mysteries of life: love, death, and beauty. Does that ring a bell? Deb, that kind of does ring a bell, and I think you may be onto something. I know there's a passage that he has on miracles, and he quotes somebody saying, "There is only one miracle, it is life." I'm looking here. No, I'm going to say maybe, but that one doesn't come straight to my mind. Yeah. Another question here from Dual Garcia. Is it okay for a Christian who isn't Jewish to wear tassels? I talked with someone who genuinely wanted to know, and I said I have no idea. I feel like Marty is probably the person to answer this question and not me, considering that he is Jewish. My thought would be maybe, I don't think about it as okay or not okay. Britt, do you have a thought about this?
I'll save you, Reed. I was
Thank you.
just going to point out, I don't know where this person is in the podcast, but my
Okay.
recommendation would be to listen to the episode on Leviticus, which I believe is 25. And then once you get to session 4 and you go through the conversation in Galatians, that's going to talk about how all of that fits together in the Christian world. So if you're not to Galatians yet, hold on, that's coming. But if you are at Galatians, now it doesn't necessarily completely answer that idea, that question, is it okay?
Right.
It's a little bit more complicated than that. A lot of that's going to boil down to what is the community that you're in? What kind of people are you around? What are you communicating by doing that? Is it going to help or actually just be a stumbling block for people? There's all those other questions. But as far as like the Levitical laws and then how that applies to Gentiles, Christian Gentiles, followers of Jesus, that will come in Galatians. So if you want to leave a comment, let me know where you are, then we can maybe have a conversation. You can get in touch some other way, but that would be my recommendation.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that. I do remember that Marty had talked about it somewhere. Thank you for pointing out where. Definitely good to go just listen to that conversation. Let's go on. We got another question. This one came in before. This is from Nate. This is from last year. So Nate, hope you're listening. Nate says, I'm 56 years old and was raised in a very conservative Christian home. I've been in church all my life and am now an elder in my evangelical free church I currently attend. When I first heard your first few episodes, I was not impressed and stopped listening for a while. That's okay. Everything goes against my very deeply embedded views. Totally get that discomfort. Totally understand that. He said, after I started listening again, I really appreciated hearing the Jewish perspective. So Nate, I would just take a second to applaud you for going back and doing what it was an uncomfortable thing and not just shutting down when you heard something that made you uncomfortable or that you disagreed with. So I applaud you for that. And then he said, I have just finished session 5, and on the Revelation, Nate was not a big fan of the Revelation take and feels that this takes away his hope for the future. And he said, I'm really confused about what you feel is next. What is going to happen at the second coming of Christ? I want to say first that the sentiment, one of the sentiments that's underneath this question of just, are things going to be okay? What's going to happen down the road? That is that's a sentiment that a lot of us feel. I think it's a very natural, very human thing to wonder, like, in the end, are things going to be right? Is everything going to be okay? And I also understand, like, the impulse to kind of know, if I know what's coming, if I can have some kind of certainty, then that certainty becomes a kind of hope or a kind of comfort for me. I think one of the things that the scriptures present throughout, though, is a challenge. Like, I think about the prophets, and prophetic hope was often not in any kind of outcome. I mean, sometimes I think the prophets saw doom on the horizon. Not the ultimate horizon, but that there were bad things coming, difficult things coming, painful things coming. But the hope was not in, like, that particular outcome, whether good or bad, but I think the hope in God's own self. So just maybe we sometimes need to temper if there's something in us that's like, well, my hope would be in knowing what's going to happen, just in that knowledge. When it comes to second coming, and Brent, you can let me know. I'm sure that there are, I know that there are Bema episodes where the word parousia has been talked about. And if we want to link those or drop those for anybody, that's great. Parousia is political language. That's the word for the appearing for when what we call the second coming of Christ. Parousia is political language borrowed from the world of Caesar, that Caesar would have a parousia when he would come and visit or appear in these various towns. The episode, by the way, is episode 161 on First Thessalonians, the passage about the trumpets. So if you want to hear more of the Bema discussion on that, episode 161. But the idea of Caesar's parousia is an interesting one, because while it is a forward event in the future, it is actually the actual substance of the parousia is very much about what has been going on in the present. So Caesar would come to visit a place and he would want to know, well, what has been going on here while I've been away? How is this city being productive for the empire? What's the state of the citizens? How are they faring in the here and now? And so again, the idea of the parousia was a future, like, there's this anticipation, right? There's this expectation, but it's about what's been going on in the present. And so even when we think about parousia of Christ, our Christian habit, our tendency to make everything about the future, maybe needs a little tempering here, to recognize that maybe part of what the writers of Scripture are getting at when they talk about the parousia of Jesus is wanting to place the emphasis still on faithful living here and now in the present. That Jesus might show up and might want to know, how are we doing in the here? How have we been doing? How are these various outposts, these communities, how are they doing for the kingdom of God? Have they been about the business of the kingdom of God? How are the citizens faring? How have they been faring in the here and now? Are they about the things that God is about? Have they been about that, or have they been about something else? And so I don't know that there's a lot of language that is kind of fanfare, and I think it's meant to draw parallels with what would have been going on in that day with Caesar. So I don't know that we can, with any kind of certainty, say, well, this is what's going to happen at the second coming of Christ. But thematically, it seems like a big part of the thrust of the parousia is how have things been in the present. And I also just want to say, to speak to the idea of losing our hope for the future because we don't necessarily know exactly what's going to happen at the second coming, and just about the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is written to an audience that needs great hope for the present. They are experiencing a lot of trial and tribulation and persecution in that very time. And so the encouragement is stay faithful. Keep your loyalty and your worship to God. Maintain that as your focus. And like, God will make everything, the judge of the earth will do right in the end. He will. But for now, it's like our focus or our hope for the future is actually, like Jesus has always been about, hope for the present, faithful living in the present, accountability for the present. Let's go on to another question. This one is from Henry. And this says, in Luke 19, Jesus encounters Zacchaeus and shares the 10 minas parable, and then enters Jerusalem on Lamb Selection Day. Here, Jesus weeps over the fate of his people. And Henry says, is it possible that Jesus' interaction with the hated Zacchaeus was his example of how Jerusalem should have dealt with the Romans in their midst? The method that people chose, military and political, over shalom and hospitality, was in clear contrast. And then finally, is there possibly a chiasm in Luke 19? Henry, I want to say that I love the impulse behind this question. How do we live with our enemies? And how do we live with the people who are supposed to be like on our side, Zacchaeus, who is actually seems to be on the side of the enemy? Because I don't think that Zacchaeus was a Roman, but he was at least working for them. And so being like an insider, somebody, kind of working for the man, working for the bag, that's a betrayal. And I think, Henry, you're onto the right thing, that this is about how we treat them. And what I love about this story, what I love about what Jesus does with Zacchaeus, is that he doesn't, like, it's different than his encounters with other people in the Gospels who need something from Jesus, who need to be healed, or they need some kind of a spirit cast out, or anything like that. It's not that Jesus, notice, he is giving Zacchaeus an opportunity to do something for him. He is giving Zacchaeus, it's a very dignifying thing, I think, to say, I'm going to come to your house and let you serve me. I'm going to let you show hospitality to me. It's like there's an honor there, to say, of all the people who might, because I think it was an honorable, it was a privileged sort of thing to be able to host a rabbi in your house, and to feed them, to provide something for them for a time, to give them a place to sit, and that Jesus isn't just, healing Zacchaeus or just telling him, like, it's all good, you can go on your way, but then actually giving Zacchaeus the chance. I just think that's such like a subversive and beautiful thing to do. I mean, when the others are grumbling about it, they say, he's gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. He's not just going to be with the sinner. He is going to be the sinner's guest. And how beautiful of a picture is that of how we should maybe treat people who are not doing right by our people, who are the Romans or the enemies, that they would give them a chance actually to be the ones hosting us. I mean, what a beautiful thing that is. What a beautiful lesson we might learn from that. I think about a term that comes from Walter Brueggemann called accommodation resistance. I heard Marty talking about this summer. He was doing a teaching on the Book of Esther, and he talks about this idea that like the way that we are with empire or even with enemies, it's not just resistance. It's not just a bunch of, waving our fists and getting out our pitchforks and talking about how bad they are. It's not just about accommodation either. It's not laying down and saying, okay, well, whatever you want, we'll do things your way. But there is, I think about when Jesus talks about being as wise as a serpent and as innocent as a dove, there is something shrewd, and we're not doing things your way. It's subversive, but also it is gracious and even dignifying. You think about the other people like the Roman centurion that Jesus ministers to. I think about even the story of the demoniac, is what they call it among the tombs, the man with the demon. And Bama listeners might know about the story, the legion, and they're cast into the pigs and they drown. And I think there is a level of reading that story that wants us to see maybe this demon-possessed person kind of represents Rome. And Jesus is driving like that, what did you call it, Henry? The military and the political might, that kind of corrupted power, like driving it out, but doesn't destroy the man. That at the end of the story, the man is clothed and in his right mind. And I wonder if there's a way of reading that story, like a certain interpretation you can take that says, Jesus loves the Romans too. And Henry, you're dead on. Like shalom and hospitality over military and political power. I love the way you phrase that. That's a phrase. I'm going to take that with me. But I think in all of our we have to be careful about this. Those of us who are maybe a little bit more on the social justice side, a little bit more on the progressive side, in all of our very good and right attempts to put our emphasis on the poor and the marginalized, which again, hear me, yes, we should do that. Yes, 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 a million times yes. It is also important to remember that God wants the rich and the privileged too. He wants them too. And it would be, we're losing our path a little bit if we become all about like the people that Zacchaeus was oppressing, and then we want to get out our pitchforks for Zacchaeus. He needs to be redeemed too. So there's your food for thought on that question. I love the question though. As for a chiasm, I don't know. I looked at it a little bit this afternoon. I am not sure what it would be if it's there, but maybe. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you can do a little more digging and let me know what you have found. Okay, let me take a look at this doc here. Okay, Brent thinks I should take the question about the midrash, so let me go for it. I'm just going to do it live. Where did that go, Brent? There it is. From Caleb. Are there any teachings or midrash about the firstborn son and the origins of the firstborn's importance, right to the birthright, and right to the blessing from the patriarch? I understand a natural way this would develop from them being the heir of the family and the oldest, but I wonder if there's also a connection to Cain and Abel. Abel chose to give God the fat portions from the firstborn of his flock. I wonder if there was no precedent before this. What if Abel is the origin of the importance of the firstborn when he chose the firstborn of his flock? And also how meaningful and heartbreaking it is if he chose the firstborn because of the love and respect he had for his brother Cain. What if the legacy and importance of the firstborn is because of Abel's offering to God? I mean, maybe. Yeah, I don't know of any midrash about that. I don't know. I think when I think about the firstborn and just the significance of that, and that also like as Marty has talked about before with the Behor, and there is both a privilege and a responsibility that comes with that. And yet there is also an inversion of that at times where we see, I mean, many times the younger is taking that instead of the older. So I guess it's a short, disappointing answer here, but I will say I don't know where the origin would come from. But what stands out to me is that that inversion of it that we see at times. Okay, I'm going to move on to this question. This one hit me when I was reading through the doc. This is a question from Alicia. This is actually a recent question, just from a couple weeks ago. And she just says, if I feel fearful or afraid about a situation, does that mean that I am not trusting the story? Gosh, I mean, I just first want to say thank you, Alicia, for like such a simple, honest question that is actually a profound one, and that I think has got to be something that so many of us struggle with. Fear, of course. It got me thinking again about just maybe recapping for a second. What do we mean when we talk about trusting the story? It's kind of a Bema-ism. It's maybe the Bema-ism, trust the story. And just to recap a little bit of what we have in mind, like when we say that, we think about leaning into the belief that God really does love you, that you really are the beloved of God, full stop, no qualifications added to that. You are the beloved of God, and that your origins are in goodness and just in the grace and goodness of God. And it also means leaning into that for even others around us, maybe ones that we find unlovable or at least we find hard to love. That is what it is to trust the story, not just for me, but for them. And then we also mean we're talking about working to partner with God to put the world right, to take seriously that we have a partnership to work for justice and mercy and righteousness. That's kind of maybe a big general overview of what we mean when we say trusting the story. And what I notice about that is that when we actually do those things, those often take us right into situations where fear is kind of a normal response. Like if I'm partnering with God to put the world right, that's probably going to cost me something. The sacrifice that I have to make. Or if I'm going to show mercy to somebody or lean into their belovedness when, man, they're really not acting like it, that there might be a fear there that what this person's going to take advantage of me if I show them mercy, or they're going to start just taking handouts, if I'm trying to be charitable and sacrifice for them, or just like the very, act of relating to people who aren't like me, because the story is the story for everybody. I mean, that's kind of the mystery of the gospel, right? Is that it's everybody. And that can be uncomfortable. So I just want to say, first of all, that struggling to trust the story is definitely not the worst thing that you can do. And it's actually in that place when we are struggling to trust the story that God so often meets us. I mean, from the very beginning of the scriptures, think about the man and the woman who they didn't trust the story. And in their fear, they go into hiding. And notice this, when God meets people in the scriptures who are afraid, who are having a hard time trusting the story, he asks them a question, different questions. And I'll just go back to the Buechner thing I read at the beginning. One of the beautiful things about scripture is sometimes you come across it and you're like, that's my question. That's the question that comes from my soul, or that I feel like God is asking to my soul. And so like the man and the woman are hiding in the garden, fearful. And he says, where are you? He's looking for them. Or I think about Jacob. Marty and I and Brent, we were just working on the kind of 2.0 of the Jacob episodes. And Jacob is terrified of meeting his brother Esau, which is it's trusting the story, right? It's about reconciliation with his brother that he has wronged. And he gets met at the river in the night by this strange figure, and he wrestles. And this man that he is wrestling with asks him a question. He says, what is your name? This question about where are you and what's your name? Like, what's your identity? And I was thinking about Elijah when he's on the run because he is having a hard time trusting the story. He is afraid of Ahab and Jezebel. And he gets met in a cave by God, and God asks this question. He says, what are you doing here? Or I think about Jonah, like the quintessential fearful to trust the story guy in the scriptures. And God meets him and he says, do you do well to be angry? And then, of course, I think about Peter from the Gospels, who was afraid and had a hard time trusting the story. I mean, it all looked really, really like it was going south. And he denies being one of Jesus' disciples. And then Jesus meets him on the beach, resurrected Christ, and he says, "Do you love me?" And so when we experience fear, I don't think fear is a failure to trust. What I want to say is that fear is an occasion to trust. And when we feel that fear, we then can act and trust in spite of it, or sometimes we do give into it, right? We go the wrong way. And even there is nowhere that we go that God is not going to find us. And so my personal belief is there's never really any way to get out of the story. Like not really. Read Psalm 139. It's like my own personal catechism, top to bottom, everything in it. You can't get away. And if you mess up, if you try to hide, God will come and find, and he will probably have a question for you. And so, Alicia, I hope that helps you. I hope you find some comfort in that. And I hope maybe you can get some time for yourself to get some quiet and and maybe hear whatever question it is that God is asking you. Question from Jason. Live question related to the earlier question about Christ's second coming. Is it possible that just like Jesus' first coming, where most people didn't recognize him because he didn't meet the understood expectations of the Old Testament descriptions of Messiah, do you have any thoughts on it being the same with his second coming? That is to say, perhaps God left the details of the second coming vague, like the Old Testament did many of the details of his first, and only the second, after the second, will it be clear. Jason, I have wondered that many times. I'm not going to lie. Like, and I even wonder about the ways in which Christ comes to us now. Like, there is the ultimate sort of second coming that, we hear talked about, and that, again, frankly, I don't know a lot about it. I know that we don't know the day or the hour. That it seems like what's clear is that nothing is clear when it comes to that. But I wonder how many times Christ comes to us and we miss it because we don't have our eyes open. Like I think about the parable of the sheep and the goats, and he separates them out, and the people are like, "Well, when did we ever see you? Like, when did we see you?" And he's like, when you didn't clothe the naked, and when you didn't visit the prisoner, and when you that you didn't do it to the least of these, you didn't do it to me. And so, yeah, I guess, I don't know. I think what's more helpful for me, if I'm thinking about how do I craft a life of faithfulness in the present, I am trying to think about, are there ways in which Christ is appearing to me today in the face of an unlikely person, or in the very person of an unlikely person? Yeah. Last question before our pause for station identification, live from Sam Dooley. How is Reed's fantasy team doing? Sam, I don't play fantasy football. What,
The
Brent?
people want to know, Reed. They want to.
I
They want
don't.
to know.
I don't play fantasy football. It would consume my life. I can tell you how my real team is doing, and they're 2-0 and on their way to a three-peat, and it will happen. And if anybody wants to know, while I have the opportunity to talk about football, I will say this in 10 seconds. If anybody wants to know when Reed Dent knew for sure, without a doubt, that the Chiefs were going to three-peat, there was a play in the first game against Baltimore where Pacheco is trying to pound the ball into the end zone on like a 3-yard run, and there's a big pileup, and Mahomes throws his whole body into that pileup and starts pushing backwards, like doing like a squat basically in reverse to get him through. And Mahomes is the first one who falls through the pile into the end zone, gets up off his knees. That's a quarterback who's all in, and he's also the greatest quarterback in the NFL. So everybody better be scared. That's it. I'm done talking about football.
I mean, exceeds expectations, Reed.
Mahomes does?
No, you, in the way you answered that. I was kind of wondering if you played fantasy because I have the exact same problem as you. If I did it, it would consume my life. So that's why I never have.
I mean, it is kind of a fantasy to have the Chiefs as your team. Like, we won the cosmic lottery. Mahomes is our quarterback. Like, we
I thought
won
you
the
said you were
cosmic
done.
lottery. Sorry.
All right. Well, we're a little bit before the hour, but Reed is not going to be with us for as long. as a normal Q&A. So we're going to pause at this point and thank the people who make what we do possible. I'm coming up on 5 years in on my BEMA journey as a paid staff member. Well over a decade since I started my first BEMA class. So it has been quite a journey, but more recently we've added Reed and Elle and Josh, and you guys get to experience the fun of them answering questions in a unique way compared to Marty. Lots of Marty questions, lots of Q&As with Marty. That's not going to change, but it's good to mix it up sometimes because each of us are on this team because we have a different perspective and a different thing we bring to the conversation, and so we want to have, like, we're all here, like we want to all be part of the conversation too. So thank you for that. And I'm also just going to be a little bit selfish and share that if you want to know what we're doing and what's going on and where we can meet you or where you can meet us, depending on how you want to look at it. But I love to meet people. And I'm actually going to be in Washington, D.C. area coming up second week in November. I just found out about that. If you're in Chicago or Janesville, Wisconsin, I guess you can go see Marty instead. But if you're in the D.C. area, I'm going to be there. So that's coming up. And at the top of the news page on the BEMA.discipleship.com website, you can also sign up for the BEMA Messenger, where we send you about once a month, pretty much consistently once a month, because that is the way we work. But yeah, you'll get an email with all that stuff as well. So you don't necessarily have to check the website constantly. But yeah, it's happening. So thanks, everyone. Back to the questions, Reed.
All right. Let's we got another live question here from Zachary Griffin. Do you have any insight or encouragement about Matthew 22, where it states that marriage doesn't exist in heaven? Seems painful to become one person on earth for an entire life, only to be separate in the next life. I've just never heard of a teaching that is actually encouraging about this. Zachary, if you are married, it sounds like maybe you're married and you're very happily married, and I am very happy for that for you. I don't have a lot of insight about this passage, not off the top of my head. A couple of things that just on a very cursory glance that stand out that would be fuel for further study into this passage. Notice that just before this, Jesus gives a teaching on the parable of the wedding feast. So in Matthew, there, like we're getting some teaching about a marriage, a wedding. And then the conversation with the Sadducees here about not being given in marriage. I don't know. I think some of my questions like that would pop up that I would want to look at is what comes right after that. They are like angels in heaven. Like it feels like there's a conversation going on here that's off script or that's off screen that I don't know about and would like to know about. This actually makes me think, I don't know if you've been listening at all, Zachary, to Elle's Talmudic series with Matthew, Talmudic Matthew, where she is, it's an excellent series, by the way. I can't recommend it enough. Where Elle is reading Talmud and then bringing insights from her research into Talmud into how they comes to bear on what we hear in Matthew. It gives us a sense of like what is the first century conversation, or what might be the first century conversation going on around Jesus. There's a really good one on salt and light, and where Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world." And some things in Talmud about temple and salt and light, and it added so much color and was like, oh, this actually clicks. This makes a lot of sense now, and I've never heard teachings on this. So I wonder if there is something going on there. That is my sense, but I don't have anything more than that for you right now. We got a message from.
Do you have like a beeping thing going on in the background? Do you have like an oven
I do.
timer?
Sorry, I didn't hear with my headphones. One second. Keep him busy, Britt. Tell him a joke.
The joke is Patrick Mahomes is scrambling again, and hopefully he gets something done right. I don't know. Is that the penalty that you guys were looking for earlier? We're not even we're not even in the second half yet, so I don't know. This is terrible. He's
It's really
back.
strange. Sorry, it stopped when I got up. So I'm going to keep
Just
this
making
off like this.
Patrick Mahomes scrambling penalties, not even the second half, whatever.
Anything can happen. It's live television. It's chaos. I'm going to leave this one off in case I hear it again, but it stopped. It sounded like my oven timer, but I don't have anything in the oven.
Yeah,
So,
don't burn your house down in the background, please. That'd be a terrible
boy,
time.
that'd be a way to go out. Um, anyway, we got a message earlier this year from Andrew, who had listened to our episode on Psalm 13, which, for those of you, if you don't know, Psalm 13 is the one that very famously starts off with, "How long, O Lord? How long will you hide your face from me? Will you forget me forever?" And it's what we call a psalm of disorientation, which means that, like, this is a psalm that comes from a place, an experience of, I thought that the world kind of worked one way, and then things are like falling apart. It's experiences of loss, experiences of grief. And Psalm 13 is just an expression of that kind of, the anguish, the disappointment, even the doubt of, do you see me? Have you forgotten me? Anyway, so Andrew was listening to Psalm 13, and he shared with us a friend who had a song that a friend had written, who he had written the song after a battle with cancer, and it sounds like he beat cancer in that battle. He's doing youth ministry in Tennessee, and Andrew just said, "How long, O Lord," will always be a phrase that I hold dear. And I just want to say thanks, Andrew, for sending. There's no question. He was just putting that in there as an encouragement and to say that it resonated with him. And I guess I would just echo by saying it is so important that we let these Psalms of disorientation be what they are. We need a place. And what I love about Psalms of disorientation, like "How long, O Lord," or even the psalm that's like, we had to hang up our lyres in the trees and we can't sing songs, and it ends with this angry rant and this imploring of God, like they want to like throw the babies off the cliffs, which is like really hard to stomach if you come from a viewpoint that's like anything in scripture must be condoned by God, and that's not at all. I mean, this is expression, this is venting, this is poetry. But it's so important that we have canonized as Holy Scripture these voices that are saying, sometimes it's not okay. And sometimes God feels more like he's playing a game with me than that he's taking care of me. We need those to become prayers for us, people who maybe have felt like at times, I'm not allowed to talk like that. I'm not allowed to doubt God. But if it genuinely, when that is what is within us, we need Psalms like Psalm 13 to help us get that out and direct it toward God and kind of engage God in this wrestling match with us. So yeah, thanks for sharing that, Andrew. I'm glad the Psalm series was beneficial for you. We got another question from another live question. This is from Cameron Carter. Cameron Carter. Oh yeah. What's up, Cameron? As your faith has developed specifically away from how you were raised, did you experience any struggle discussing faith and theology with others that held to your perspective? I'm 4 to 5 years into my Bema journey and sometimes don't know how to talk about things that have taken me this long to wrestle through. It made finding community with other believers difficult. Short answer, yes. At times, I have had a struggle discussing that with others. For me, I have, I don't like run around with everybody in my life trying to say, well, do you know this idea about the Bible? And do you know this idea about the Bible? And I'm not saying that's what you're doing either. Although I think sometimes maybe when we get new ideas into our head, we get really excited about them. And that's kind of what we want to do. Like we start treating people as sounding boards for whatever, like our new clever, idea about a chiasm or a midrash is. But I think for me, I have just tried to focus on friendship first. And there's this great line from, it was Pope John Paul II, and I'm butchering it a little bit, but to paraphrase pretty close, he said that the appropriate context for theological inquiry is love and mutual friendship. And so for me, I have been like immensely blessed in my life to have like my friend Derek. He was on the podcast with me last year, whenever that was, and he has been somebody who is, and he's like kind of my one person that for many years is like, this is who I can do the deep dives with, and we can talk about all of those ideas. So I haven't needed it to be a lot of people. I have been fortunate to just find one who has just that mutual kind of questioning and mutual kind of interest. That was episode 356, by the way, with Derek Rohr. It was in our spiritual practice series. It was about spiritual practice of friendship. But yeah, I just want to say, Cameron, like you're not alone, that it can be difficult to find ways. But I think what we can do is in our own selves, just continue to model like charity. So like if I'm in a church group where I don't feel like I can quite break in with whatever the ideas are that I want to discuss, I want to be a charitable listener even for other people's ideas. And I think that if we are winsome in that way, if we demonstrate that kind of charity and good grace, then we will find places where we can actually discuss those and be heard and discuss and like have somebody talk back to us in good faith. So don't give up. Don't give up. So this question is from Susie. About Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, episode 45. I felt there was so much that you really just flew over. There is so much valuable information there for saving our souls, and sometimes we just need that recap on our lives. I really do enjoy the podcast. Thank you so much. I feel like we could do an entire session on Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and maybe someday we will. There is so much there to be mined. So totally agree with you that there is so much there, Susie. And I could not agree more with you. I do love the wisdom literature. I have done a series on it at CCF a couple of years ago. And yes, it is true. If anybody's read Asking Better Questions of the Bible, chapter 5 was pared down quite a bit, but initially was just one big long read, dent, quote fest. So I will pat myself on the back for that one a little bit. Marty texted me when he was writing, in the process of writing, and he's like, can I just take your stuff on wisdom? And I was like, go for it, dude. But then the publisher was like, yeah, we can't just quote somebody else for an entire chapter. So we worked on it and it was great. But yeah, that's all in good fun. We joke about that. Yeah, Marty will tell you that wisdom literature is like maybe his least favorite thing to teach on. But I can tell you, I was with him for a week this summer in New Mexico, and I listened to him speak for 5 straight days on wisdom literature. And it might have been my favorite stuff I have ever heard Marty do. It was excellent. And this was actually really cool. For the first time, Marty and I got to like team teach. We did a session on the Psalms together. And I don't know if Marty's still around watching, but Marty, truly, that was like one of my favorite things that I have done like at all. And one of my favorite things that I've done with you. So we should do that some more sometime, go somewhere and do some team teaching. But I think he is listening. Hi, Marty. What I want to point out, and whenever I talk about the wisdom literature, is that there is this fundamental tension that is essential to recognize. And it's not an either or, it's a both and. And you have your proverbial wisdom, like Proverbs, that sets a stage for the world works a certain way. It's kind of like a clock and it's wound. And if you do things, there's a cause and effects kind of logic. You do the right thing, you save your money, You're going to have money when you're old, and you're going to be comfortable when you're old. You treat people right, you're going to have a good name and a reputation, and things are going to go okay for you. And that's good. There's a cynical side of us that sometimes is like, that's not really true. Well, hold on, we'll get there. That's what Ecclesiastes is for. But it is essential to start. I mean, when we teach our kids, we don't start by saying like, yeah, everything's meaningless, bro. Like, I don't know. Here, let me change your diaper. Like we we don't do that. We start by saying, no, like you need to behave, like you need to be good. You need to do your homework and study. When you I have a high schooler now, and like if you want to have a chance at doing things later, like you should apply yourself at school. That's all right and good. But then you get a little older, life happens. And as Ecclesiastes says, the race doesn't always go to the swift, and the battle doesn't always go to the strong. And I see people who are righteous dying before their time, and I see people who are wicked living long after they should be gone. And that's not how it's supposed to work. And it's kind of an irresolvable tension. And I think we just have to say, yeah, like we need both. There's a line that I took from Rachel Held Evans in her book Inspired. She has a chapter on wisdom literature, and she says it's not about what is true, but when it's true. And there are times where what we need to hear is the proverbial wisdom, and there are other times where what we need is the ecclesiastical wisdom. And so, yes, totally agree with you, Susie. And I encourage people to mine those gems of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes without trying to resolve it all and make it fit in like a neat, coherent, logical agreement kind of package, but just to let them. There's this great movie called First Reformed, and there's a pastor figure in that movie, and he says, wisdom is the ability to hold two opposites in tension in your mind at the same time. And a wise life is what is lived between them. So take that with you, and maybe we'll get to doing a more full wisdom series at some point. Okay, a couple more questions here. This one is from Shannon, and she says, there's a few questions here. I'm going to read it all at once. Big questions. She says, how did Abraham and people in the Old Testament hear from God? Was it a voice in their head or heart? Was it audible? How did they know to trust the voice? So that's one package of questions that I want to try to address. And then there's another one. Also, how can one know what is a story versus a real event in the Bible? Adam and Eve, real or story? Noah's flood, real or story? And then Shannon says, my background is full gospel Foursquare, where I was engaged and immersed in teaching and preaching what I believed was absolute truth. But I've been on a journey for the last 10 plus years discovering new things. Great question, Shannon. And I know that this is something many of us have wondered. And as I'm talking about the first set of questions about how did people hear God in the Old Testament? Was it audible? How did they know how to trust? And I know for me, there has been a kind of longing behind that is, if only I had experienced something like this story, then trust would be easy, right? Like if only I had seen a burning bush, if only I had walked in the Garden of Eden, if only speaking of Abraham, like if I had seen something as wild as a smoking pot and a flaming torch floating between these animals that had been cut in half on the ground, then undeniable evidence, boom, it's settled. I can't speak for everybody. I have never experienced anything of any of that sort. Not exactly literally, like it would not, not like that. No. And there is a part of me that's like, man, I really wish I could just hear the voice so that I would just know. But I also think that deep down, it's not just that we want like an undeniable certainty of what God is saying, or even for some people, like, is God even there? Like I imagine Buechner has an essay about this called Message in the Stars. And he wonders, like, what if God one time just rearranged the stars of the Milky Way galaxy for like a day or a week? And when you looked up at the night sky, you just saw the sentence, I exist, spelled out in stars. And what would happen? Thought experiment. Like, what would happen in the world? How would people react? How would different kinds of people react? How long would those reactions last for? And he comes around at the end to say, I don't actually think it makes all that big of a difference if it's undeniable or not. That what we want to know is if there, not just whether there is a God, but does God care for me? Does God actually love me? Is God doing anything in the world? That is what we are dying to know. And it would be nice if we could know by hearing, like, just the smoking pot and the torch. But it brings us to the question, so what did they actually experience? And I can only say I don't know. And I'm not really sure that anybody does for sure. And it's one thing when we read these stories to believe that God was speaking to them in one way or another, which I do. I mean, this is kind of like a matter of faith. This is the wrestling match of faith of who God speaks to. But the particulars, the mechanics, like, I don't really know if we can really say for sure. Like, maybe it was just as the stories report it. Like, maybe the biblical narrative really is just a straightforward recitation of the facts. And if that is the case, then I'm still left to wrestle with my one life, the one that I live, that doesn't actually have these sorts of undeniably clear voices and these supernatural set pieces that are going on. But I think it's also possible that the biblical stories maybe are closer to my own life and the lives of others than that, where things happen to us in our lives that sometimes what we need to be able to say is not the details of it. What we need to be able to say is the meaning of it, the significance of it. Like, I think about when my children were born, or like if you're an athlete and you won the big game, or like the first time that I met my wife, or just these, or maybe something happens in me that I feel like this is a God thing. And then what do? You need to be able to share that somehow, but that, like, saying just like reporting the facts of like dates and times and numbers, like, that doesn't really capture like the truth that is lying underneath these facts. And so we have to reach for other kinds of ways of speaking, not that they may not be factual, but that doesn't mean they're false. And in fact, they may be more true than just the facts. And so, like, when it comes to the Bible, like, how do we know whether or not a story is, like, we're reading just a straightforward factual recounting or not? We may not know. Like, we may not have like an airtight answer about that. I mean, we can look at things like there's archaeology, there are other ancient texts and accounts and those kinds of things, but we don't always have that. And even then, like, we're connecting dots, we're making assumptions. But like, just because we don't have, and I want to say, like, just because we don't have evidence doesn't mean that it's not quote unquote real. But also I want to point out, it's not like there's maybe a false dichotomy that it's like what we're given in the Bible is a binary choice, and either or. Either it's real and it actually happened, or it's exactly the way it says it did, or it's completely made up. Walter Brueggemann has a phrase called imaginative remembering, where he talks about, the people of Israel are remembering a real history, but they're remembering it imaginatively, not because they're trying to lie to anybody, but because if you are a people who have had an encounter with the God of the universe, the heart of all existence, like the mystery behind all mysteries, you got to have ways of talking about that might not be just like a straightforward recounting of the facts. Or like, there's a really great book called The Poetics of Biblical Narrative by a guy named Meyer Sternberg. And he talks about like he says there are three sort of impulses that the biblical text has. One is ideology. It's ideological. The Bible is ideological. It wants to communicate to you theology. It wants to communicate to you doctrine. It wants to communicate to you basically like a certain view of the world and a view of God. Okay. It also is concerned with historiography, is what he says. So ideology, historiography, like things that happened to us as a people. Wants to talk about that. And then there's a third angle of the text, which he calls aesthetics. And the aesthetics are the style in which that you employ to say it in the most effective way. And he talks about it's kind of a 3-in-1, like it's a unity in variety, and that all three of these elements can be at play in any part of the text. That it is communicating, like it has an ideological motivation, that it wants to communicate something about history, but it's doing it in an aesthetic way to get across the significance of it. Does that, I hope that's making sense. I really wish we could be talking so that like I could know if this is making sense to you. But I do think that like we are familiar with this idea that like the truth and the facts are not always necessarily the same thing. And my episode, the first episode I was on in the podcast, 206, The Nature of Truth, I give some examples, and I'll just recall, I'll recall one of them now. And that is, so we just had the 23rd anniversary of 9/11. And if you go back and read accounts of 9/11, like pretend you're in a library and you go to visit the section that is the periodicals, and you pull out the Wall Street Journal from September the 12th, 2001. And it's giving you dates and facts. United flight, whatever number, took off from this airport at this time. There were this many people on board. It collided with the tower at this specific time, and this many people perished. If it gets any of those numbers wrong, it's errant, right? It's not reliable. But you can go to the poetry section and you can pull out volumes of poetry that poets, American poets, and also international poets wrote about that event in a poetic way. And like there's one by a poet named Scott Cairns that I really like. And he talks about, he's drawing a parallel between 9/11 and the pillar of smoke and the pillar of fire in the Exodus narrative. And he talks about how we became the smoke and the fire. Is that true? Is that true? And is it true in the same way that the Wall Street Journal is true? Like both can be true, but one of them is more, and we have different standards. Okay, so that's, I'm talking for a while about this, but basically like the facts may be one way to tell the truth. But there are other times where we have to reach for language that goes beyond facts in order to actually get at the truth of it. So I'm going to leave that there. And then how do you know, again, there's lots of other just resources, studies. This is the nature of like genre criticism and all of that kind of stuff when applied to the Bible. But I'm gonna leave that there for now. Okay, and then let's go to this last question here from Joe, also a recent question. Said, I am currently struggling with many areas in my life, and I called a friend to discuss my issues. He then proceeded to tell me the reason I am struggling is because I am not right with God. And here there's a note, Joe admits my relationship could be better. Hey, me too, brother. It's all of us. And then Joe says, I took the message so far as God using an unlikely vessel to communicate with me. Here is where my alignment differs, and I wonder what the Bible really says, and I believe you have the most unbiased opinion. My friend believes I need to be in a spirit-filled church where the Spirit of God chases the demons and people speak in tongues. I come from a skeptical background because the people in my life who proclaim their love for God were phonies, and I cannot believe that a pastor or follower could invoke the Spirit of God at will. My friend says it is because they are in alignment with God, and I am not, and the demons within are making me skeptical. I also, the demons within are making me skeptical. I also believe in the Bible that if you speak in tongues, there needs to be an interpreter, and if one person is turned away from God, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. I have seen many documentaries where someone claims to be in alignment with God, and it turns out to be a cult. What is your feeling? What does the Bible say? Ooh, Joe, big questions. But essentially, they do boil down to this idea of being in alignment with God, or kind of if you are right with God, then you won't struggle. Sounds kind of like an assumption that's underneath some of what your friend is saying. We'll get to that in a second. I want to say I also grew up in a spirit-filled church. People spoke in tongues. People cast out demons. And I want to say first that I value things from that church. There were things that I really did benefit from, and I really am glad for my time there. There are other things that I was glad to leave behind, which I suspect that that's probably the case with almost anyone from any kind of a church background. I think any church is a mixed bag. There are things that are worth taking, and there are things that are worth leaving behind. And there were people there in that church that did things like speaking in tongues or chasing out demons, as you say. And I would not do those things now. I don't do those things now. But I don't have any doubt about their faith, their love. And I do know that many times those people were as Christ to me. And so I'm not saying that you're saying this, but I want to say that their strange practices don't always make phony people. And that probably from various perspectives, a lot of anybody's practices can be strange. And so, like, yes, there are such things as phonies, but I think you'll find them in lots of places, and that like quiet contemplative people can be phony as well as like raucous spirit-filled ones. So I just want to like show some love to anybody who comes from those kind of spirit-filled charismatic backgrounds, not throwing any of you under the bus at all. Again, I'm thankful for my time in a church like that. And there are things that I don't do today that I would have done back then. And that's okay. We grow, we change, we learn. As to the assertion, though, that what your friend is telling you, that they are in alignment with God and that you are not, and that it's demons that are making you skeptical. I mean, I hesitate to like weigh in on conversations that I don't know both people. Like, I'm not trying to mediate a conflict between you, Joe, and your friend. But this kind of talk is fear mongering, and I don't think it recognizes the mixed bag that is many people's experience. Like when we say demons make you skeptical, then what we're saying is like any kind of skepticism, any kind of questioning or doubt is not of God. And that the high goal of faith then is to never be skeptical about anything. My man, Frederick Buechner, bring him back in, he talks about an agnostic as a definition. He says an agnostic person is someone who isn't sure whether or not there is a God. And then Buechner says that is some people all of the time, and that is all people some of the time. And so I want to encourage like you to Joe to say like it is okay to have questions. I have recently we've been doing Mark at CCF, and there's the man who brings his son who's like having seizures and has a demon, and the seizures cause his child to throw himself like into the fire and the water. And this is where we get the line, I believe, help my unbelief. Jesus says, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. And the man says, I believe, help my unbelief. And Jesus doesn't say, the demon has gone into you and is making you skeptical. Like, we got to get that unbelief out of you. Nothing like that. I believe, help my unbelief. And that actually like skepticism is, Richard Rohr said, I was listening to an interview with him some time ago, and he said, a people that is incapable of healthy self-criticism will become idolatrous. It is not good for us to not have any questions about who we are or what we're doing. I'm not advocating like cynicism, but I am saying that like if we never have any reason to question what we are doing, that kind of like, especially God endorsed unquestioning self-confidence can very quickly become a license for like terrible things. And so skepticism has a place. And I think this is why, like, and I tried to encourage this on the podcast before, for those of us who are able to have like communities where people know us and love us, and we can discuss our skepticism in a healthy way without accusations flying back and forth. As to the assumption, if you are right with God, you will not struggle. Let's read the book of Job, because that's like a Job's friend's response. And God says, the friends are not speaking right of me, Job. They say like, oh yeah, like things are going wrong for you, Job. You must have done something. Like, you're not right with God, essentially. And Job's like, wait a minute, I didn't do anything wrong. And God's like, well, yeah, you didn't do anything wrong. This isn't about that. Or I think about in John chapter 9, when there's I think it's a blind man. And the people say, well, teacher, why is this person blind? And they lead Jesus in the question. Like they think they already know. And they say, why is this person blind? Is it because of his sin or his parents? Like they know it's got to be one of them. In other words, somebody's not right with God. And that's why this guy is blind. And Jesus is like, what? No, like it's not about that. It's not about anybody's sin. And actually watch this. And then he heals the guy. So I think like the scripture, I don't need to belabor this point, but the scripture is like full of stories of people who have their questions and have their doubts, and they're not cast as demon possessed. They're not cast as being not right with God. Like I'll just take us back again to Psalms of disorientation. The person who is crying out, will you forget me forever? Like this is a person who has some skepticism. They have some doubt, and that's not a demon possessed person. So you're okay. If you're struggling, you're okay. Again, I will point you back to what I said earlier. Fear is an occasion to trust the story. The struggle is an occasion to trust the story, and that God may meet you with a question of his own for you. Okay. And then here's a note from Julie Carmen Little. Been enjoying CCF's teachings on Mark. Oh, somebody listening to CCF stuff. Thanks, Julie. Thank you to your team. Especially enjoyed Stephanie on Mark 5. Dude, for real. And here's the thing. I like, after we had doled out the, sorry, people may not be interested, but I'm going to give you a little behind the curtain on CCF, the way we plan our sermon series. So we had handed out like CCF assignments, and we usually give people a choice. Like, you want to do this, or this? So I made the mistake, well, what I thought was a mistake, of letting Mark 5 be like somebody else can have it. Usually I take first dibs because I do more of the teaching. And I was like, dang it, I really wish I had done Mark 5 on the demon possessed man who lived among the tombs, because I thought my teaching was going to be so cool on it. And then Stephanie stepped up and she knocked it out of the park. And I was like, wow, God, you really prevented a disaster there. Like, it would have been so dumb for me to be the one teaching this chapter. Like, it could not have been better than what Stephanie did. So yes, Stephanie was great. Also, Julie, your note being encouraged by mine on Mark 6. Thank you for your encouragement. I really appreciate that. And I think, what a note to end on, CCF sermons, but I think that about brings us to the end here, Brent.
Yeah, we got to get you out of here. We promised you'd be done in time for your family to come home. And I didn't implicitly or explicitly promise this, but we got to make sure you're not burning down the house or whatever. So
Wait, I didn't hear it go off anymore, so I think we're okay.
I didn't hear it either. I think we're good. In my mind, I was picturing one of those like little white, semi-squarish ones with the little rubbery buttons with
Yeah, I
like
know
a
what
big
you're talking
LCD
about.
display. Do you have one of those? Because that seems like the kind of
No,
thing that you would have.
it's not that.
Okay. Well, anyway, our next Q&A, Marty will be back for that one. I believe we already have a bunch of questions for him, so I'm sure we'll be back to our regular 2-hour situation, but that is coming up on Sunday, October 20th, unless you are in like East Asia or Australia, and then it's going to be early Monday morning, October 21st. Not really optimal time. There's no optimal time for everybody in the world, unfortunately. But yeah, we'll be back then, and thanks for joining us, Reed. Thanks for sharing your perspective. Thanks for getting a couple of Chiefs jabs or something. I don't know. We've got the prediction on record, and we can clip that out and put it in the podcast when they fall flat and don't even make the wild card or something.
Amen.
That's not a real prediction. It's not a real prediction.
Oh Lord.
I'm sorry. That was terrible. I don't know why I did that. That was so mean. You've been so generous with your time.
It's
so
foolish
sorry.
because now you're on the record, Brent, as saying that the Chiefs are not going to make the wild card. So
yeah,
led by the Spirit. Led by the Spirit.
Marty,
my
why
joke
are you
was, how did he? Is he here? Is Marty here?
Oh, I heard him. You didn't hear him? I don't know.
I don't know.
It's fine.
You crack too many jokes, I show up.
It must have been the audible voice of God.
Yeah, I was joking the other day. There was I saw this chart about like the fan bases that are most hopeful for their team to win it all, and the Saints were just like, I mean, it was just like a gentle curve all the way down to the bottom, and then just like this big old jump. Like no Saints fan believes that they're going to win it, and I'm like, if I bet $10 on the Saints and they actually win it, I could pay for a mailer with that chart and send it to everybody in the Saints territory, which is just a terrible waste of money, but that's how my mind works. So I don't know. I'm just instinctively petty or something. Whatever. Thank you, Reed.
My pleasure.
And thank you everyone for watching. We'll be back in a month.